Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Romina Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications. How are you, Tim?
I'm great. How are you? Happy Easter week to you.
That's right. What are your Easter plans?
I'm actually going to be an orphan for Easter this year because following week I'm having a little oral surgery done, and my folks are going to come for that. And so we kind of decided, well, does it really make any sense to go back and forth, in such a short amount of time? So we're going to have Easter the following Wednesday while they're in town before my last rites meal before I have gum surgery.
Well, I think our Easter is going to be pretty quiet too, just because we're still a little bit careful about COVID. My mother's 90 plus, so I think we're just going to have a little family celebration and keep it small.
Candy, obviously, is the hallmark of every big American holiday. For me, Easter candy is probably my favorite candy, even better than Halloween or Valentine's Day. And my weakness is jelly beans.
Oh,
I've been known to be that person to go to CVS the day after Easter and buy up all the jelly beans at half off.
I love the crunchy chocolate eggs, the ones that can crunch. I forgot who makes those. Those are delicious. I can just pop those in my mouth all day long.
I think those are Cadbury eggs.
Oh, I love them. Well, I thought we would take a moment to highlight some of our work on our blog, Right by the Bay. Tim, you wrote an excellent piece on your trip to Hawaii.
Yes, one of the things that was one of the highlights of our trip is I did a Circle Island tour. And, you go through all the little highways and you go through the little towns and shopping areas. And we came across a gas station. And I noticed that gas prices were $5.08 a gallon, which was significantly less than what I had paid filling up right before I left on my trip. I think I paid $5.80 something a gallon. So I got to looking into the issue, and it's really interesting. Hawaii, like California, has high gas taxes. They are the fourth highest gas taxes of the nation. California, of course, we're number one. But one of the big issues is an antiquated law called the Jones Act. And the Jones Act, you may have heard of, but it was a 1920 era's law designed to boost the U.S. shipping industry. And basically, it requires that if you're having shipments from the U.S. mainland, not only does it have to be a ship that flies the U.S. flag, it also has to be a ship that was constructed in the United States. Well, since the 1920s, we don't make any ships anymore. We have a global economy. So there are really only like 90 ships total in the United States that meet the requirements of the Jones Act. And for Hawaii and Puerto Rico, our U.S. territories, it makes it very difficult for them to get supplies from the mainland, including oil. And in some cases, it's practically impossible. So now that we have, the issue where oil companies are not importing oil from Russia anymore, Hawaii may actually have an oil crisis because really imported oil under the terms of the Jones Act is the only way they're able to actually get it here. So our PRI sister think tank in Hawaii, the Grassroot Institute, has been leading the charge for years to reform the Jones Act. And they called on President Biden to have a 1-year suspension of the Jones Act so that they can get oil, A, and B, perhaps they could get more domestically produced oil that actually is cheaper. And they are being joined in this effort by Congressman Ed Case, who's a Democrat from Hawaii, and other Democrats there. And I thought it was interesting that you see on this issue of importance, you see, people from across the spectrum are coming together and calling for this change that would benefit all Hawaiians. But yeah, you contrast that to what's California doing to address our gas crisis and, the astronomical prices. You see finger pointing, and you see, some are even having proposals to impose new taxes on gas production. So what I think the people of California and our elected officials could learn a lot from the movement that you see for reforming the Jones Act in Hawaii.
Yeah, and it was a really terrific piece, Tim, and I recommend everyone to take a look at it. Now, I wrote another piece, similar theme. Newsom had posed a gas relief package But interestingly enough, he's going to infuse public transportation agencies in California $750 million as an incentive to provide free public transportation for Californians for about 3 months. Now, first of all, we all know there's no real reason to provide free transportation because users aren't affected by the rising gas prices. Moreover, I don't think this is going to work in cities where public transportation is totally free. Many of them in Europe, studies have shown that it doesn't reduce ridership. If it's free, walkers and cyclists are the majority of people who end up using free public transit. And another study in Santiago, Chile, where they gave out free passes, people didn't drive to work less, but actually took advantage of the free passes to have some fun, go to the parks, restaurants, shopping. So you're not really reducing ridership when you're giving away free public transportation. In fact, you might it encourages bigger budgets and maybe even increase carbon emissions. So if Newsom thought he could change Californians' habits, it's not going to work.
And as Kerry Jackson wrote previously on Right by the Bay, public transportation is full of germs as well. So do we really want to be encouraging Californians to take these germ-infected vehicles?
Right. And we also have a couple of other terrific blogs, one by Steve Smith. I wrote an excellent piece about the state's policy mistakes when it comes to public safety, which actually led to more crime. We got another terrific one from Kerry Jackson, who wrote about the never-ending saga of Californians leaving the state.
Yeah, it's interesting, the piece on crime. We're PRI's office in Sacramento. We're just blocks away from where we had the tragic shooting, not too long ago. And, the more we learn about the case, Prop 57 certainly played a role in the credits being increased that allegedly made one of the alleged assailants eligible to be released early. And so, you're already saying you can expect a lot of don't look at me, they did it and I didn't do it. But it really crystallizes, the importance of these. We need to really take a hard look at these sweeping public safety policy changes that have been made in recent years and see these unintended or maybe not, maybe intended consequences that are now having real life tragic consequences.
Yeah, and our Steve Smith is going to be doing a study on that later on in the year. So look forward to seeing it. So we have a really fascinating interview this week with Paul Mango. And Paul was the deputy chief of HHS, Health and Human Services. And he was one of the key leaders of Operation Warp Speed, which everyone knows gave us and the world COVID-19 vaccines. I thought the book was absolutely gripping. It was a real page turner. And Paul gives readers an insider's view about how the government managed to harness the U.S. health industry, everyone from the pharma companies to the distributors to retail pharmacies, along with our military and so many other companies to come up with a vaccine in record time.
If you love the kind of behind the scenes story and, in some cases of, the interesting gossip you didn't hear during the time, this is a great book to read. And I think you'll all enjoy the conversation.
Yeah. And Tim, over the years, I've had a very dim view of government and bureaucracy. Here in California, got the horrible DMV, the scandals in the California Employment Development Department, rails and bridges never getting built, or all these construction problems. You get the feeling that the U.S. can't seem to do anything right anymore. And I was so happy that I was proven wrong with Operation Warp Speed. And it's really a shining example of what America can do with great leadership.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's, when you consider what they did in such a short amount of time, it really is a modern day miracle.
So thanks everyone for listening. And here's Paul Mango, author of Operation Warp Speed. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Paul.
Hey, thanks for having me, Rowena. I'm really pleased to be with you and Tim today.
So to set up this for our listeners, Paul, tell us about how you found yourself in the middle of Operation Warp Speed. What's your background? How did you come to join the Trump administration? And talk about your role in Operation Warp Speed.
Yeah, Well, I think there's a lot of serendipity involved, but I'll just go back a little bit. And my background is I've spent about 30 years or so in the healthcare industry. I started as my career as an Army officer, then went off to business school and joined McKinsey and Company out of business school and got deeply involved with healthcare and spent a good part of my career advising and helping large healthcare companies and health insurers and large health systems. And in 2006, I was asked to go down and speak with Secretary Mike Leavitt and then Deputy Secretary Alex Azar about a role at HHS. So this was during the Bush administration. And I met Alex then. And while I didn't think it was a good fit because it was the second half of a second term president at the time, and those two were honest with me saying, we're really not going to get much done, but we'd like you to join, I decided not to. But I stayed in touch with Alex Azar. And in the late spring of 2018, right after he had been confirmed, he was confirmed in early 2018 after Tom Price left, he gave me a call and said, hey, how about this time? How about coming down this time and joining us? I need some help. So I went down and I spent a year as the chief of staff at Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, a great experience. And then he asked me if I could come up to his staff, his what's called the immediate office of the secretary, as his deputy chief of staff for policy to coordinate all of the policy in the department, which was fascinating. And that was in the summer of 2019. And sure enough, 6 months thereafter, we get a call on January 3rd of 2020 from Dr. Robert Redfield, the director of the Centers for Disease Control, saying we have a problem in China. And we were back from our Christmas, vacations, but one day when that happened, and all of our roles changed. And as we went through the first couple of weeks of the COVID response, it became clear to us that we would need to accelerate the development of a vaccine. And Secretary Azar asked me if I could be his formal kind of deputy to Operation Warp Speed as formal liaison, which involved working with the Department of Defense, all of the support functions from Health and Human Services and the White House and the Hill, quite honestly, all the folks up on the Hill, to make sure everyone was brought along and that all of the resources the team needed and all the support the team needed was a high priority for everyone. So again, a lot of serendipity and all of that, but I have to say an extraordinarily privileged and honor to be part of Operation Warp Speed.
So in your book, you give us a terrific backstory of how Operation Warp Speed really all came together. Can you take our listeners through it all the way to that Rose Garden event in May 2020 when it was formally launched?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't realize that we actually had a very good vaccine early on in the pandemic. And what was going on was Moderna was working with the National Institutes of Health, and in particular, Dr. Fauci's group, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And they were working on some cancer research using the mRNA technology. And on January 10th of 2020, so just days after we learned about this outbreak in China, the DNA sequence of the coronavirus was published for the whole world to see. And the NIH and Moderna took that, and within 10 days, so by January 20th of 2020, they actually had a good vaccine. Now, we didn't know it at the time. It needed to be tested in trials. It needed to be manufactured at scale. We didn't know it, but effectively, the formula for the Moderna vaccine was developed within 10 days. We had an organization within HHS, within the Department of Health and Human Services called BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. And its role was to make investments to accelerate the development of medicines, and in this case, therapeutics and vaccines for coronavirus. And it had started doing that. We made a big investment in Moderna. Peter Marks down at the FDA, who runs all these long terms, the Center for Biomedical Evaluation and Research, CBER, we called it. That's the center within the FDA that approves vaccines or authorizes them for emergency use. Peter Marks had already started scanning the world in late February and March for other vaccine candidates, and there were about 95 at the time. So I relate this because there was a whole bunch of activity going on. However, it wasn't coordinated, it wasn't integrated, and it was a little bit of, I think, what Secretary Azar would call business as usual. And then at the end of March, it was March 28th of 2020, we get a call or I get a note handed to me. I was in the secretary's conference room. I get a note handed to me from his assistant saying, Alex Gorski, a different Alex, would like to talk to the secretary if he has a chance. Now, Alex Gorski was actually a good friend of mine because I was at West Point with him. He's my wife's classmate there. And he was also the chief executive officer of Johnson & Johnson. And we got him on the conference line. And the first thing he said was to Alex Azar, he said, I just want to thank you for the $450 million grant you gave to Johnson & Johnson earlier today. It'll be in the papers tomorrow. And so Alex Azar puts the phone on mute and looks at me like, do you know anything about this? I said, no, I know nothing about it. And I was supposed to know something about it, but I didn't. So he gets back on the line and goes through all the niceties of saying, good luck with it. Hope you can get a vaccine out quickly. And then he hangs up. He goes, get the BARDA folks in here, because the BARDA folks were the ones who dispensed the grant for $450 million. So other than not notifying us that they were going to give away $500 million of government money, the secretary had a simple question for them. What are we getting in return for our $450 million? And Johnson & Johnson, or the BARDA folks said, well, J&J is going to start its trial, its phase 1 clinical trial in September. And Alex Azar then said, well, that's business as usual. We're not getting anything for our $450 million. And that was the impetus for Operation Warp Speed. Azar at that point said, we have to change all of the parameters of how we're doing this. We have to get Johnson & Johnson back on the line. They have to start their trials a lot earlier. We're going to help them do that. We're going to start manufacturing product right away, even though we might have to throw some of it away if the vaccines aren't good. But I want tens of millions of doses of vaccines available the day that the FDA gives us an emergency use authorization. So the other thing he said that day is we need some talent from the outside. We need the best manufacturing minds in the world, the best vaccine development minds in the world, and they're not inside the government, nor should they have been inside the government. So we started interviewing candidates, and we got Dr. Monsef Slaoui, who's one of the primary characters in the book, as you know, and we got a gentleman named Carlo De Notari Stefani, and both of these gentlemen had spent their entire careers, over 30 years, in vaccine development and vaccine manufacturing, respectively. And we went over to the Pentagon and got Secretary Mark Esper, who was tremendously collaborative throughout this whole thing, to give us Gus Perna, the head of the Army Materiel Command, the 4-star general, and his team. And remember, these guys have been supporting combat operations in the Middle East for 20 continuous years since 9/11. They were the best logisticians in the world. So we had our team together within a number of weeks, 2-3 weeks into April. We had our team together. And then we, of course, developed a strategy, which became the strategy for Operation Warp Speed with that team. And then, as you mentioned, we went over to the White House with Jared Kushner's support to have a Rose Garden event on May 15th of 2020. So within the span of 4 to 6 weeks, we identified all of our needs. We recruited great talent from the outside, the best talent in the world. We developed a strategy. We were off to the races. And I think the Rose Garden event was a way for the president to tell the world, and to tell in particular the rest of the federal government, this is very important to me. I expect everyone to cooperate. And that's how we broke through a lot of the bureaucratic machinations that normally take place within the federal government. So, Tim, that's the story. I know it's a long answer, but that's the evolution from the day we learned about the virus until the Rose Garden kickoff.
Now, right around this time, we recall that the media and the scientists and some of the doctors that they interviewed said the U.S. couldn't possibly have a vaccine ready in about a year, and that it would take years to go through the process of approvals and clinical trials. But you outline in your book 5 reasons why Operation Warp Speed was a success. So let's start off with the first one. Well, the first 2. One, the science had already been developing for many years, as you alluded to, and 2, tasks that were traditionally done in a linear fashion were accomplished simultaneously. Tell us about these aspects of the project, especially the latter, which rarely happens in government, as you know.
Yeah, on the former, just real quickly, we talked about the mRNA technology, but I asked Monsef Slaoui one day, who was great and very patient with me as I posed a lot of questions. But I said, Monsef, why is this could this happen so quickly? And the analogy he gave me was that of a cassette. He said, with mRNA technology, you put a cassette in to a machine to try it. If it doesn't work, you pull it out, you put another cassette in to see if it plays, so to speak. And he said it's just so much faster than the normal biological development of a vaccine, which takes place, in vats and that type of thing, and that has to simmer for a while and take time. So that technology had been under development for over a decade, but had never been used for a vaccine before. So that was a huge success factor, no question about it. But then, as you mentioned, Rowena, I think Alex Azar had spent 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry at Eli Lilly prior to being the secretary. He knew a lot about pharmaceutical processes, manufacturing, risk tolerance, what they'd be willing to invest in, what they wouldn't. And what they typically would do as a pharmaceutical company was, try to develop the vaccine, discover the vaccine, and then put it into clinical trials, the first clinical trial, the second one, the third one. They'd pause in between each step. Then they'd go to the FDA for approval, and only if they got approval would they start manufacturing. And that's, led to very long timeframes. So what we did was plan out all of their clinical trials at once. And in fact, it was only a day or two between the time they'd finish, let's say, a phase 1 clinical trial and go into phase 2. Normally, they wouldn't even start planning phase 2 until they were done with phase 1. But we did all that planning for them. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we began manufacturing millions of doses of vaccines in the summer of 2020, many months before we even knew which of our vaccine candidates might or might not get emergency use authorization from the FDA. That's never been done before because it costs hundreds of millions, in some cases, billions of dollars to manufacture the number of doses we were manufacturing. And very, very few pharmaceutical companies could sustain that type of risk, if you will. But in the book, there's also a couple of other things that needed to be done simultaneously. Vials. Where were we going to get the vials that could contain minus 80 degrees Celsius vaccines without shattering? That glass didn't exist before we invested in Corning to develop on an accelerated basis a good vial for the vaccines. We had to secure 1 billion needles and syringes because these vaccines, depending on which one, and we didn't know which one or which 2 or which 3 were going to be successful, they took different gauge needles to inject them. They took different size syringes. So we had to be prepared for any outcome. All of that had to be acquired during a global pandemic when everyone else in the world was looking for needles and syringes. And then, of course, we had to set up the distribution system. And Gus Perna and his team did a magnificent job of engaging the private sector. These iconic companies, McKesson and CVS and Walgreens and UPS and FedEx and an information technology company called Palantir, and really orchestrated them to an integrated distribution system that performed flawlessly, absolutely flawlessly. And on day one of vaccine distribution, we had enrolled 50,000 different vaccine sites into an IT system so that we could get vaccines to them quickly, effectively, and track exactly where they were and how they were being used, and tell the governors, hey, this is what happened last week. Where do you want your allocations going this week? So all of that was done in parallel. And on day one, which was December 14th of 2020, when the vaccines first arrived in Americans' arms, basically were injected into Americans' arms, it was flawless in terms of the storage and transport of the vaccines. All of the syringes and needles were there. The information technology system didn't experience a single glitch. So maybe there was a little bit of luck involved in that, but I have to say it was really a team and a multidisciplinary group of individuals who had brought different talents to the table that made it happen.
Paul, so you mentioned in your book that there was some thought that the vaccines would be distributed through public health systems. Private sector ended up dominating the distribution system. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was some tension, and I talk about this in the book. It's one of the 3 sources of tension, but the tension existed between the members of the Army Materiel Command and the Centers for Disease Control. And both sides were extremely well-meaning. Don't get me wrong. Dr. Nancy Messonnier was the physician down at the CDC, and she had been with the CDC for decades. Very talented woman, but had a strong preference for, as you said, Rowena, using the public health facilities and the public health infrastructure of the United States to distribute and administer as many of the vaccines as possible? Well, first of all, these public health departments were overwhelmed, quite honestly, with just dealing with the basics of COVID. I mean, it was still, we were in the middle of major outbreaks, and they were strained, and they should have been strained. They were doing a very, noble job of trying to control the virus, but they were shorthanded, had people out because of COVID and so forth. But more importantly, they just weren't as sophisticated. So I'll give you an example of what CVS did for us. Remember, the first two vaccines required 2 injections each, 3 weeks and 4 weeks apart, respectively, for Pfizer and Moderna. And one of our big concerns was getting people back for their second dose. Because let's say they felt bad for a day or two after their first dose, maybe some persons wouldn't come back. And, the record in the United States of getting people back for vaccine courses that require more than 1 dose is not all that great. It's about 70% come back, is what we learned. So one of the things CVS did with its information technology system was when you went in to make your first appointment online with CVS, it required you to make your second date 3 and 4 weeks apart before they would give you your first vaccine dose. And the reason they did that is a behavioral science term called status quo bias. So if you make that second appointment, it's harder to cancel it, after you've made it, so to speak. And we had very, very strong performance on people coming back. I think it was like 98% of all persons who got the first dose got the second dose. But the reason I talk about that is the public health infrastructure, your county health department had no way of doing that. They didn't even have electronic scheduling for the first dose, let alone the automatic appointment for the second dose. So it was an easy decision for us, but I think it was difficult for the CDC because their entire days and weeks and months, all the time is spent with the public health infrastructure. That's their role, is to interact with the state and county and local public health entities. And they wanted to support their brethren, so to speak, but we couldn't tolerate that. We needed the best and most responsive, most innovative, most electronically advanced companies in the world doing it. And that's what finally happened.
Another reason you believed Warp Speed was such a success was what you called its, quote, venture capital approach in selecting the vaccine research programs that the government was going to fund. Warp Speed elected to pick 6 different vaccine programs rather than 1. And this approach was met with some serious resistance, especially from Dr. Deborah Birx, head of the White House task force. Tell us about all of this.
Yeah, so this was the second of the third points of tension that I bring out in the book, and that's between Dr. Moncef Slaoui and, as you said, Tim, Dr. Deborah Birx, both extraordinarily talented individuals. But I perceive Dr. Birx as being limited by what she knew. And what I mean by that is she had a lot of experience with a different vaccine technology, which we call protein subunit. And there is a vaccine that's about to be approved, I think, by the FDA, by a company called Novavax, that is a protein subunit vaccine. And Deb Birx used these vaccines because, as you know, she was very active in Africa and other places working on HIV, and she knew the manufacturers, and she pushed very hard for that, saying it was a much more robust vaccine. Moncef Slaoui had been a board member at Moderna. Before he joined us, he left that board to join us as the chief scientific advisor on Operation Warp Speed. And he deeply understood the mRNA technology, but more important, he had spent 30 years as the most successful vaccine developer of our generation. And he knew that there's a lot of glitches involved with developing vaccines, the discovery, the manufacturing, the storage of them. And his strategy, as you said, Tim, was more of a venture capital mindset, which was we're going to take 3 fundamentally different technologies, mRNA, viral vector, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and then the protein subunit that I talked about. And not only are we going to choose 3 different technologies, but we're going to invest in 2 different companies in each of those technology platforms. That's where we get the 6 from. Now, some persons criticized us, and I talk about this in the book. They said, well, if there were 95 vaccine candidates, why didn't you invest in 20 instead of 6? Because we had the resources to do it from a financial standpoint. Each of these investments was about $2.5 billion. And the answer was very simple, because the logistics of getting those vaccines out and getting them through clinical trials, the logistical complexity grew exponentially with each new vaccine that we added to our candidates. And that means we had to get more needles. It means, with a minimum of 30,000 persons, I should say, through each clinical trial, that would have meant more people competing for fewer slots or fewer people competing for more slots. So the decision was made that the logistical constraints would limit the number of investments we made. And that's why we landed on 6. We were contemplating 7 at one time, but 6 is where we landed. And what we knew, again, and what a venture capitalist knows, is we only needed one to be successful to have an almost infinite return on investment in terms of lives saved and in terms of economic, the economy and economic growth. So it was a very easy decision to invest in 6, knowing that we only needed one. And Monsef Slaoui and Deb Burks very contentious about that, because Deb said, let's put all our marbles in the protein subunit. And Monsef said no. And again, Monsef won that argument. And interestingly, the 3 vaccines that have been approved by the FDA for emergency use are not the ones Deb Burks were backing. It's the ones in the other part of the portfolio that won out. So good decision in the long term.
Well, you also attribute Warp Speed's success to its governing structure. So Tim and I have been in government, and we know how bureaucracy and red tape, politics, egos, on and on can slow down any worthwhile project to a crawl. So what made Warp Speed different?
Yeah, it was, as you said, we set up a governance structure, which was very simple and effective. We had a board that met every Friday morning throughout from May, middle of May, until we left the administration in January of 2021. That board had as its co-chairs Alex Azar and Mark Esper, and then David Norquist from the Department of Defense after Mark Esper left the administration. He was the deputy secretary over there. And we had we had representatives from the White House, such as Jared Kushner, and we had the key individuals within HHS. And in total, this comprised maybe 12 persons, very limited to those who had relevant knowledge and needed to know. And the board reported directly to the Oval Office, the President of the United States. And that cut through weeks and months of, what would typically be interagency processes that got everyone's approval. It was a national health emergency. We couldn't afford to do that. And, the trade-off is, would someone have had some input that could have made it marginally better? Probably, but it wouldn't have made it marginally faster, would have made it a lot slower. So we traded speed for maybe comprehensiveness. But, we brought this external talent I talked about from the outside, which was the best in the world. So we thought it was a very low risk if we didn't get everyone's input, but we thought it was a much greater risk if things got bogged down in the bureaucracy. And the president was fantastic. He would, if we needed to see him, I would call Jared. I'd pick up the phone. I'd call Jared. I'd say, we need to see the boss here pretty quickly. He'd have us in within hours, as long as the president was in town. And we'd go over there and, he would give us the input we needed to make some pretty big decisions. Or if we needed him to make a phone call to a CEO or to make a phone call to a different part of the government, he would do that for us without question. And that made a huge difference.
So picking up on that theme, the final reason you cite and kind of discussed it a bit in your prior answers is leadership. So in your view, who were the key players who showed great leadership traits in Warp Speed? And maybe you could expand a little bit on, what President Trump's role was throughout the process.
Yeah. And let me start with him. I characterize him in the book as the executive sponsor of Operation Warp Speed. What does that mean? Well, it means he got us the resources, the attention, and the air cover within the government we needed to be successful. But it's just as important to note what President Trump didn't do. And what he didn't do was micromanage the process. He never once inserted himself or insinuated himself into the development of these vaccines or the manufacturing or the distribution process. He let the experts do their thing. So that was very important. Second is Alex Azar. As I said, 10 years in the pharmaceutical industry before becoming secretary. No secretary in the history of our country of Health and Human Services had that kind of experience. And he is the architect in the book of Operation Warp Speed. And his leadership was principally intellectual. He kind of developed the strategy, if you will, that we pursued and executed against for the year we were there. But in the book, I go into really the core of the leadership that made the biggest difference beyond those two were the combination of Gus Perna and Monsef Slaoui. And Matt Hepburn, one of the physicians who was helping in the vaccine front, talked about, when I interviewed him after the fact, talked about those two having very similar leadership styles, even though they came from vastly different backgrounds. And their leadership styles were servant leaders. They were servant leaders. That's what they were. They enabled their people to be successful. They trusted the folks who worked for them. They invited everyone to participate and offer advice. They were clear communicators. They would not tolerate anyone who was not a team player. And we had to take action on a few folks. So the fact that they hit it off so quickly and so resonantly with each other was absolutely key to the success, because the hundreds of persons we had working beneath them looked at those two and said, there is an example of collaborative leadership and we need to follow. So it was really quite extraordinary. We were so lucky to have, brought those types of individuals and those types of leaders onto the team. Really fantastic.
So, Paul, given all the reasons you cite, could another administration have come up with a vaccine in such a short order? Or was it a unique set of circumstances? You have the science, you had a president who was not a professional politician, the healthcare industry that was able to coordinate and harness its resources towards one goal. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Rowena, I think it would have been very difficult. I don't want to say it could not have happened entirely, but let me tell you why I think it would have been difficult. And that is President Trump had this inveterate belief in the private sector. He came from the private sector, but as important, in the early days of the pandemic, when we were short of ventilators, he turned to the private sector and said, I need more ventilators. And I'll give you two numbers. The first number is the installed base of ventilators in the United States before the pandemic, about 80,000. He turned to the private sector, and in 90 days, we had an additional 100,000 ventilators. This was General Motors, Ford, General Electric. They converted their lines to produce ventilators. So the president had this experience. And when we went and briefed him on Warp Speed, he right away got it and said, yeah, there's no other way for us to do it. So I think that's a piece of it. I think also, as I observe this administration, the current administration, they have centralized, or they did centralize the entire COVID response in the White House, which never would have worked under our administration for Operation Warp Speed, because as I mentioned before, need to let the experts do their thing. And I have I use a funny term in the book about when you create a skunk work, which is kind of a common term for business. When you put a group of multidisciplinary experts together, you sequester them, you give them the resources and let them be successful. I use a term in the book, when you create a skunk work, let the skunks do their thing. And that doesn't happen when you centralize and use, kind of authority, which is what this current administration believes, much more in authority. And I use a statement from my prior life, which is leadership is not about being on top. It's about being out in front. And I think President Trump understood that being out in front meant, let's let Monsef Slaoui and Gus Perna and Carlo Di Natale Stefani do their thing. I don't need to be the guy who is, the authoritative figure on top of that. But that's not what I see with this administration. It's just a difference in philosophy about the private sector and about decision-making and about authority. And so therefore, I kind of doubt it could have been done under the current administration.
You just mentioned a little of what President Biden is doing differently. And certainly there was a lot of criticism from the Biden administration when they took over the vaccination program. And they actually said they had to start from scratch. So reading your book, this was blatantly false. So tell us about this transition between the two administrations.
Yeah, well, this took place in an intense political context, all of Operation Warp Speed. It was a presidential election year and, a lot of division in the country and so forth. And it started before then, Tim. It started when the then candidate Biden and then candidate Harris basically said you shouldn't trust a Trump developed vaccine. But of course, they were two of the first in line once the vaccines were authorized by the Food and Drug Administration, even when we were still in office. It's pretty interesting. But, I talk about it in the book, and, that's politics, right? They want to lower the bar so that they look better. And I think, they said we had no plan. They said they had to start from scratch. They said we left them a mess. And from a political, point of view, I guess I can understand their logic of doing it. But what they failed to understand was that they had hundreds of career officials from the United States Army and the Department of Defense, from the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, throughout HHS, who did not leave with the Trump administration. They were career officials, right? They stayed. They had been working day and night for 7 months prior to that, every weekend day, not a single day off, to deliver this for the American people. And when their new leaders under President Biden said, you guys left us a mess, I can tell you morale within that team plummeted. Because I talked to them afterwards. I talked to my former colleagues who stayed on, the career officials. They were all demoralized by that. So it actually served to hurt the Biden administration when they thought politically it was the right thing to do. But and I also talk in the book about it couldn't be farther from the truth, because if imitation is the highest form of flattery, what they did was take our plan and executed it almost precisely in terms of the distribution and the rollout of the vaccines. On the day we left, the CDC reported that in the prior 24 hours, we had vaccinated 1.5 million Americans. They scarcely kept that pace for the time they've been in office. So we left them a tremendous amount of momentum, and we left them a plan that they took and somewhat ironically almost executed to the letter. So anyway, I understand it as a political appointee. I understand the politics of what they were trying to do, but it was a little bit immature.
So, Paul, are there lessons to be learned from this pandemic?
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of lessons. That's part of the reason I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure that people understood that we had to scramble to get a lot of things done that I hope never have to happen again in the middle of a pandemic. One of them is we had zero excess manufacturing capacity for vaccines in the United States in the spring of 2020. We can't go through that again. That was our most challenging piece, either starting from scratch or expanding 27 different manufacturing facilities in 7 months, securing the raw materials, training the workers, finding the equipment from overseas. It was really harrowing, I have to say, to get all that done. And so we need to make sure this country is not left that vulnerable again to not having that capacity. I think I talk about a couple of other things that need to change. One of them is the federal government's ability to communicate with the American people. And what I noticed was that even when I got to the government a couple of years prior to the outbreak of COVID, very what I would call slim social media presence. The federal government does not know how to listen on social media, and it doesn't know how to communicate through social media. Yet most Americans during the pandemic, as you know, were getting their news, whether it was authentic news or fake news, through social media. And that was a real shame. I talk also about the fact that what we were challenged by, if you think about the whole pandemic, and certainly vaccines were a piece of that, what we were most challenged by was how do you, in a trust-based way, get Americans to change their behavior? That could be wear a mask, it could be socially distance, it could be isolate, it could be get vaccinated. That was the challenge, the central challenge of this pandemic, yet we didn't have a single behavioral scientist on the team. We had virologists that were very capable, we had epidemiologists who were very capable, but we didn't have a behavioral scientist. And that is a skill and a capability that is lacking in the United States government. So I think that is a lesson as well in terms of things that if we have to go through this again, I hope we address. There's a couple of other lessons that I talk about, and it gets back to governance. It gets back to delegation. It gets back to belief in the private sector. And, those are laid out. But I do think there were those 2 or 3 areas where we had to work heroically to address because they were shortcomings, kind of structural shortcomings that the government had at the beginning of the pandemic. And hopefully this book will stimulate Congress and others to think through that so that we're not in that situation again.
So finally, after all this heavy talk of pandemics and everything, our favorite question. We call our podcast Next Round because PRI is close to wine country, and we love nothing more than discussing public policy while enjoying a great glass of wine. So as you celebrate your new book and hopefully the end of the pandemic, what's your favorite drink these days that you can recommend to our listeners?
Well, I always, I have a Harvard Business School classmate, Tim Wallace, who is up in Sonoma County. And he married a woman named Patsy Benzinger. And they, in the 1980s and 90s, owned a great winery up there called Glen Ellen Winery. And then they sold that, and then they released another label called Benzinger, which is Patsy's maiden name. So I have a preference for supporting my close friends, and I drink a lot of Benzinger wine. But it's one of my favorites. Let's say there's a lot of great wine up there, but as I said, I like to support my friends.
Sure, we know Benzinger. That's a great label. So thank you so much, Paul. Operation Warp Speed, a great read. It was a gripping story. I couldn't put it down. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me today. I really appreciate it.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.